All right, server-side rendering. What is it and how can you compare it with client-side rendering? So in the last video, we have been talking about client-side rendering and how it kind of seems to be inefficient when you want to show actual personalized data, because you're first building like a very simple application on the client side, and then you start fetch data, which you're then going to add to your page to get a final result that is actually what you want. That means that you have to go to the Lego store or to the server in rendering world twice. So how can we help that? How can we make sure that you only have to go once, but still get the data that you want? And that's where server-side rendering comes into place. So I created a scenario again to kind of describe server-side rendering. This time I gave the person a name. It's Bob. Bob wants to build a Lego house again. So Bob goes to the Lego store. And this time the Lego store has a special package where you can get a pre-built, already fully complete Lego house as a template. And included with that, you'll also get the actual items to build the Lego house yourself. So this pre-built version is only there to showcase, but you actually get the items yourself as well to build it. And you might be thinking, well, why, if I already get a full template Lego house, then why would I even need all those other blocks? And that's because the template house has one special rule, and that is that you cannot interact with it. So you cannot ring the doorbell, and you're not able to change it in any way. So you cannot, for example, add the battery to the doorbell here. But that's okay, because we get all the items to build the house ourselves as well. And in the meantime, we can still use that template to showcase to, well, whoever is there. I guess the animals in the forest, they can look at our house, and in the meantime, we're gonna build our own version that's fully interactive. So that's what we're gonna do here. We pick all the Lego blocks, and we have our self-made house available, including the battery. So it's fully functional. The doorbell functions, we can get inside. The windows open. This is the top-notch house that we want. And that means we're done here. We have our fully functional house. So we move this one, the template. We don't want that anymore. We want our own house because we're proud of it, and we showcase that one. And we're not only proud of it, it's also just way more useful this way, because a house that you cannot get into is not really a house. Okay, so we reached the end now. Congrats, we got a beautiful house. Now let's compare that with server-side rendering. So someone wants to visit your website. So that person sends a request to the server. This is still exactly the same as last time. You just send a request to a specific URL, but this time we're actually not returning static files like just static HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. This time we're going to render an initial version of the page on the server. So it takes a little bit longer to send a response, but in that time we're going to fetch the data from the database, from the APIs, and so on. And with that data, we're going to create an initial version of the page. And that server-side rendered page will be sent to the client together with the fetched data. So even though that fetched data is already being used to render specific content, like for example, the name on a profile page, that data will then also separately be sent in JSON format to the client, so that the client with the JavaScript can re-render, so a client-side rendered version of the page with that data. So I added a loading indicator to indicate that this does take a little bit longer than client-side rendering, but it also means that once it gets sent to the client, you immediately get a website that you can look at, and that looks and that shows you the data that you're actually looking for. So the only downside really is that you cannot interact with it, and JavaScript is not able to change this template. So it cannot, for example, just simply only add an on-click handler to this follow button, because it doesn't know the structure of the HTML that's being sent by the server, because it needs to first execute JavaScript and render that template before it even knows the structure of it. So the only downside really is that you cannot interact with this page, and JavaScript is not able to only add that interaction. It's a server-side rendered page, and you cannot really use that besides to show what's currently available. If you want to add interaction, so on-click handlers and things like that, we're going to have to rebuild or re-render this page with the JavaScript and the data that was sent along. And that is basically what the next step is. So the next step is called hydration. You might have heard of that before. And basically what it does is it's going to execute the JavaScript with the data that you pass along from the database and so on. And it will render a client-side rendered version of the page. And it's going to compare that with what was rendered on the server. And if it finds any specific client-side functionalities, such as an on-click handler, then it's going to add that onto the button, for example. But because of that comparison, we're also having one small downside, and that is that we're rendering the page on the server, but also on the client. So we're rendering it twice, which means that there can be differences, because on the server, let's say, for example, the server is somewhere located in the United States, and that we're showing the current time right here in the corner. Then maybe it's 5 p.m. right here. But on the client, let's say it's someone from Europe, it might be way later. So initially that client will get to see that time, 5 p.m., even though it isn't that time for that specific client. And then later, when the client-side rendered page is done, it will update that and show the actual current time for that specific client. So that is a downside, and that's called an hydration error. You might have seen that before if you use Next.js. So basically it means that there's a difference between the server-side rendered page and the client-side rendered page. It can also happen if you use some kind of random value, for example, if you want to show a random value on the screen, and that value is different for each render, then of course on the server it's going to render a different value than on the client. So you'll also get an hydration error. Okay, so we have our client-side rendered version of the app available now, which is fully interactive. So it's actually exactly what we want to show on the page. So our last step would be to replace this server-side rendered version with the client-side rendered version. And then we're done. Our website is now interactive. So the time to interactive is later compared to client-side rendering, which I can show here. Because there, if you had a header here, for example, that header would be immediately interactive because you passed along the JavaScript and process that right away. But on the other hand, you get a way faster first result. And usually you're going to look at a page for a little bit longer anyways. So by that time, hydration has been done already. So you can already click on all the buttons that are available. And it might sound a little bit counterintuitive because we're now rendering the page twice, both on the server and the client. And we're also passing more data because we pass the entire rendered page and all the JavaScript and the data to the client. So it sounds like it would take longer to show the page, but because you don't have to do that back and forth as with client-side rendering, you can immediately show all the content, and that gives a way faster experience for the end user. So that's how server-side rendering works. Now, there's one thing I wanted to mention before we dive into the code, and that is that, of course, the data that gets sent from the server to the client might be kind of doubled, but that doesn't cost much. In the case of a Lego house, it's way more expensive to send twice the Lego blocks to the user, to Bob in this case. That's not going to happen, but it can give you a clear idea and kind of a mental model of how server-side rendering works. Now, if you have any thoughts about those analogies, if you think they're very clear or unclear, please let me know. I would love to hear what you think about them. And if you want me to dive deeper into one of those topics, for example, hydration, then let me know as well. I might make an additional video about it. And for now, let's dive into the code. Okay, so to see server-side rendering in action, I think it's best to create a Next application. And we're going to do that in the current folder like this. Yeah, we can use TypeScript, ESLint, till and CSS, the source directory, but we will not use the app router because we want to use the pages router to see just server-side rendering in action. And it's clearest to explain it with the pages router because the app router will combine it with React server components. Yeah, and for the rest, we can use the default options. And this creates a project for us with a root page in here. And this page will get statically pre-rendered by default, and what that exactly means is something we'll look at in a later video. But for now, we want this page to be server-side rendered. And for that to happen, we need to export a function called getServerSideProps. And it's by convention, so it needs to be named exactly this. And this function needs to return an object with props inside of it, because those props will be passed along to the component. So for example, for now, let's say that we want to pass the amount of countries. I'll hard code it for now. Then we can access that here like this. Now let's display this somewhere right here. And I'll make it a big text and white. Don't worry if you're not familiar with this syntax, it's still in CSS and it's out of scope for this video. Now let's create a build again, because I don't want all the dev server related stuff to be in the network tab. And the output of this build is quite interesting, because you'll see that it creates several pages right here, a 404 for example, and an API endpoint. We're not going to look into this right now, but it also creates a page for the root. This is the one that we have been working on right now. And as you can see, it has an icon in front of it. It's either an F or a circle. And the circle means that it's static content. And the F means that it is dynamic or server-side rendered on demand, as they call it here. So as you can see, our root page is now server-side rendered. All right, so let's start the build now. Now the build should look something like this. Now if you refresh this, then one of the most important and different things from client-side rendering is that now if we open up the HTML file, you'll see that it doesn't just contain a div with an ID of root without any content in it. It now has a div with an ID of __next, which is what Next uses, and then the actual content of the page in here. And this is all server-side rendered, and it includes, for example, the 250 that we added to our getServerSideProps. Now, this is a value that we just hard coded right now, but it can also be something that is being fetched in the backend. And we're going to look into that later. Now, I've mentioned before in the overview that we are returning not only the HTML and CSS, but also the data that we fetched on the server, just as with the Lego house, where we were also returning the separate Lego blocks. But right now we can only see the HTML. So where is that server-side fetched 250 value, for example? Now you might expect it to be somewhere in the JavaScript. That's the first place you would probably look at. So if you look for the amount of countries, you see that there's actually a variable for it, but it doesn't contain the value here. And so the value is actually returned as part of the HTML in JSON at the bottom of the page. So here you see the props property, which contains the amount of countries set to 250. So you can kind of see this div as the Lego house that we got from the Lego store, the template, which is already built with all the different components inside of it. And we can see the script tag as one of the blocks, the building blocks that we need to create that house. And in our case, it only contains the amount of countries. But besides this block right here, we also need the JavaScript to build the rest of the page, because most of this page is still all static content, and that's something that we got from the server. So if we would look for something like this string inside of the index.js file, then you'll see that it exists right here. All right, but until now, the amount of countries is just a static hard-coded value. So let's go to the code and change that. I copied this small part that we used before. Oh yeah, of course, the getServerSideProps can be an async function. So let's call it REST countries API again to get the amount of countries by returning the response.length. So after a rebuild, if I now refresh this page, you'll see that the amount of countries is still 250. It's almost as if I knew how many countries that API would return. But one special thing about the getServerSideProps function right here is that this piece of code will only get executed on the server. So you can kind of see this as the Lego blocks being created in the Lego store. So you're not allowed to know how they created exactly, but you do know the results. You'll actually see and get the Lego block. But how it's created, so in our case, with the REST countries API, we won't be able to see that. So if we would look into the JavaScript and we search for this REST countries piece of code that we used, we won't be able to find it anywhere. And that is pretty cool, because that means that in the get server side props function, we can get data with secrets that are not allowed to be known in the client. So for example, if we would have a secret somewhere right here, even if it's outside of the get server side props function, as long as it's only used by get server side props, it won't be exposed to the client. So let's say you have something that you do want to share. In our case, a small part of the secret, but something that's not secret, it's only this first part right here. Then we can return that as a prop and get that right here in the component as a string. So let's showcase that right here. I'll copy over this paragraph and just change this. And we then refresh this page, then you'll see that the no secret don't tell anyone shows up, and that don't tell anyone comes from this JSON as well. But the actual secret isn't known anywhere. So if we would search for this secret at the top, we won't be able to find it anywhere in the code. And that brings a lot of possibilities with it, because that means that here we can run database queries and stuff like that. But you need to be careful though, because let's say that we forgot to include this no secret right here in this function, then it will actually use this version and not the one that we got from the props. And Next.js won't be able to filter out the actual secret in that case. So if I save this and I now refresh the page once again, inside of the index file, you'll see that now we can find this secret right here. And that is something you need to be careful about. It won't happen often though, because most of the time when you are running code that needs a secret, it is code that can only be executed on the server. So I don't think it's something to worry about too much, but it is something interesting to note that if code is not only executed inside of the get server side props, but also in the actual component, that it will be exposed to the client. But we still haven't talked about one step, and that's the hydration of the page, because the server-side render page is now being returned and it's shown quite quickly, and then it's being replaced by the client-side rendered page under the hood. Normally you won't be able to see that, but can we somehow showcase that? It would be cool to see that in action, right? So let's go to the code and add a useState hook, just with a simple count, and where we also put the rest of the code, let's add a button with an onClick handler that increases the count by 1. Now inside of the button, we can then display this count so that we can see if it works or not. And after a rebuild of the app, you'll see that it now contains the click me button or text, and that if you click on it, that it increases. Now I throttled the internet speed to slow 3G so that we can clearly see that if I would now refresh the page, that it resets to 0. And while the JavaScript is still being loaded, you can see that right here when I refresh, that it stays at 0 until the JavaScript is fully loaded. So right now it resets to 0. I'm currently clicking on it and the JavaScript is still loading. And once it's loaded, it actually starts counting. And that showcases the hydration process. Now, of course, most people won't be on slow 3G, so it won't be as noticeable, because if we disable the throttling and you refresh the page, then it will be basically immediately possible to interact with it. But there are also some people who disable their JavaScript, for example, which I'm doing with Control-Shift-P, by the way, or Command-Shift-P for a Mac. And now if I refresh the page, you'll see that the JavaScript isn't even loaded at all. But the page will still get rendered because it's server-side rendered. And now if you click on the button, you'll see that it doesn't work at all. And it's not going to work either, but you can still get to see maybe some useful content. And one more cool thing is that even with JavaScript disabled, you can still navigate through the application. So let's go to our code and create a link, which is a next component. And let's link that to the other page. Go to the other page. I created a very simple other page right here, which is just a component with a link back to the root. Now, if you rebuild this, Okay, so we still have JavaScript disabled. There's no JavaScript on this page at all, but the link will still actually work, and you can just go back without any JavaScript being loaded. But what you can see is that when we go to another page, it has to actually load the entire document again. So it loads the entire HTML document. While if we compare that with JavaScript being enabled, we refresh the page, you'll see that if we click here, it actually only had to load a little bit of CSS because it already had the other page JavaScript downloaded. And this is just a very small piece of code compared to an entire document. And an entire document also means that it needs to do a full reload compared to JavaScript giving you that single page application feeling. And that is everything I wanted to share about server-side rendering for this video. If you have any topics that you'd like to know more about, please let me know because I'd love to make a video about it. See you in the next one.